I want to welcome you to a special episode of the Darin Sargent Leadership Podcast. In this episode, I am interviewing Mayra Martinez and her story of overcoming. You want to see this. You want to listen to this podcast. We're actually going to be doing it in two parts. So you're now getting ready to watch or listen. If you're watching, thank you for joining us on YouTube at youtube.com/Darin Sargent Leadership. If you're listening to this, thank you for listening, and make sure to subscribe in both places so you're always up to date with what is going on with the Darin Sargent Leadership Podcast. And in this episode with Mayra, we're going to be talking about just overcoming. Her story is very, very powerful, and I think you're going to enjoy this. So it's going to be in a Zoom format. So if you're listening to this, you'll just hear the audio. So I would encourage you to go subscribe or watch on YouTube at youtube.com/Darin Sargent Leadership. I'm going to get out of the way. We're going to jump into the interview now. Enjoy. This is part one, Overcoming with Mayra Martinez. This is really a great episode. Thanks for tuning in. It is so awesome to have one of the most inspiring, encouraging people on my podcast today, Sister Mayra Martinez, or Mayra Martinez, as we all know her. But in my life, she's Sister Mayra Martinez because she and her husband in 2012 came to Escondido, where my wife and I were pastoring the Point Church. They had come from one of my dear friends, Brother Chester Mitchell's church in the Ashburn, Virginia area. And they landed in Escondido, started attending our church. And as a result, they had been the Spanish pastor of the church in Ashburn. And they just kind of carried that calling with them to Escondido, which I'm so glad they did. And we launched a Spanish church in Escondido, and God just did some great things. But that's just a small portion of the story. Wilson and Mayra Martinez quickly became great friends and great leaders. They're tremendous leaders, both of them. And when they showed up, I was a little, how do I put this, Mayra? I was a little, I wanted to pinch myself to see if you guys were really real. Does that make sense?
Well, we were real, I promise you.
Because
I'm like,
okay, most move-ins aren't like this caliber. So it was a blessing to my wife and I and our church there in Escondido. But as I mentioned, this is just a small part of the story. And so before we get into that, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to speak a little bit. Maybe you can tell your story of coming to the Point Church in a few moments, or do whatever you want to do. I don't care. You can speak however you want. You can speak in Spanish. I don't care.
It might come out. Be careful what you say for. Ask for.
Oh, it's great.
But sure, let me tell you a little bit about that, actually, because a lot of people, well, first of all, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, for allowing me to come onto this podcast. I get to be a listener, and now I get to actually listen to my own voice on the podcast later on. I'm excited about that. Overall, we are just beyond so grateful that God brought us to not only just California, but specifically to the Point, where we had an incredible pastor in Virginia, and we came to a place where we believe that God completely elevated us even further in so many different areas of our lives. So during this whole conversation, you'll hear me say pastor, you'll hear me say Darin, because we really did become, overall in this last 10 years that we've known each other, 11 now, we've become not only from a spiritual standpoint, you're my spiritual father, but also you're my life coach. You are the person I call for any decision that I need to make today.
How much do I need to write that check for what you said? What do I need to put?
Darn it, I am being recorded. I better watch what I say.
All this will be used against you in a court of law.
Seriously. But Pastor, thank you very much. I really do appreciate the fact that you have been part of what I consider a huge chunk of the journey of the Martinez to where we are today. And literally, I don't know that I would even be here today to be able to tell this story if it wouldn't have been a lot because of those prayers for you and the whole entire congregation. And let me just dive into that really quickly. When we got here, we really believed early on that God was bringing us here for a greater reason than just a job. And a lot of people really thought it was a job that brought us here. And so because of that, we convinced ourselves, let's just take a couple of just months off and we're just going to relax and not really do ministry. Yeah, that lasted about maybe 3 weeks before we sat down with you. And
you can't get away from it.
That's right. And we're very grateful for that, for the opportunity for that too.
Well, as I mentioned, it was such a blessing to have you guys show up, and we quickly linked arms and began to do the work of God. You were there with us through the transition of the sale of the old building, through the year in a school auditorium, to finally the finished product that God opened up. And that's another story all in itself, how God opened that building up and that situation. But in the middle of all this, as the church began to function, as you and your husband began to pastor the church that was started, there came a moment where your health took a major downward spiral. And I remember very vividly one day when you were in the hospital, and you can kind of go through the story of how you want to tell it, but I remember very vividly your husband basically looking at me and said, okay, what's our next steps in planning her funeral? Because it was that serious. And I'm not even going to try to say the name of the disease that has attacked your body over the last several years. I'll leave that to you because I mess it up every time. And I end up calling it something like a popsicle or something like that. Definitely not that. So talk a little bit about leading up to that and that moment where this disease attacked you and some of the aftermath. I'm going to let you kind of take it from here. I may interject a little bit as we talk about this, because let me just say this. So often success really only comes from struggle. And unfortunately, we don't like that. We don't care for that. We want the easy path, but unfortunately, I'm living proof that the successes that I've endured or that I've experienced has come from the struggles that I've had to endure. So let's dive into this subject a little bit, because I think there's something here that everyone can benefit from.
Absolutely. Ooh.
It's
really tough, because in order for me to get to that point, I feel like you really need to understand the fact that I truly believe that I have infallible proof that God has always prepared my life, my whole entire, what I will call my sheet of life, which is my resume. He's always looked out for me to have 1000% joy in my life, regardless of what I'm going through. And leading up to being extremely ill, first you need to know that I grew up in El Salvador in the middle of struggle, in the middle of complete chaos. But prior to my arrival, God had actually organized a lot of that chaos in my own home. I was actually born into a home where my father had previously been an alcoholic, and he was a person who did not believe in God. My whole entire family was just in complete chaos from day to day. My father being present, from the constant blow-ups, from conflict, you name it, there was consistent chaos. And God had organized absolutely everything for my arrival so that my father would actually be emotionally and physically available for my arrival. And I'm mentioning all this prior to the story that you're wanting me to tell,
Sure.
because I think that is so critical
Absolutely.
to understand that I had my whole entire life, God had prepared me mentally to be able to experience this humongous monster that was about to unravel into our lives. So in 2018, I started experiencing horrific pain in my body. Everything from a pain that would start from a slight discomfort in my belly to my belly growing and sounding like I had monsters living inside my stomach and actually harassing me internally and trying to like crawl out. It seemed like that's what it sounded like. And my husband says I would shake consistently. No medication would take the pain away. I ended up one day in hospital in ER with them trying to identify what was going on in my belly. They thought it was just an obstruction. They thought that they were going to do surgery and that I was going to be perfectly fine. Well, they came empty-handed after all the exams. They were like, we can't find anything. That was the beginning of brace yourself because something huge is coming. I was in the hospital for 7 days. I got shunned for my eating habits. I had recently, a year prior, declared myself not only vegetarian, but went from vegetarian only 4 months being vegetarian to the remainder 8 months being vegan, because I convinced myself that if I ate healthier, my body was actually going to start calming down and I was going to be perfectly fine. I was experiencing all sorts of things from constant migraines, back pain, the consistency of feeling foreign to my own body was there. So I was desperate for anything. And in my power, I thought, let me do what I can do, what I can control. So I started controlling food, exercise, things that were possibly good for my body, but they didn't really take the pain away. Fast forward to while I'm in the hospital and being told that my body is just rebelling against me and they can't figure out what is going on with me, they land on, you need back surgery. You need to have an L5S1 fusion. I had it done 4 months into it.
I remember this. I remember this like you're laying it out like it was in my memory. It was unbelievable what you were going through.
And you're probably watching me fade completely.
You went from a very vibrant, healthy individual to bones. I mean, literally in front of our eyes.
Literally, it was like someone was chiseling away my body. And people tell me now when they see me, you look back to your normal self, they can't believe where I am currently today. But like you said, you have to work so hard. Both you and I come from a place of disadvantage where we've had to work our complete existence to where we are today. It's taken everything to rebuild. But to go back to that, so I had the surgery. The surgery was really, really bad to recover. People that have had surgery will probably agree with me. Do not have that surgery unless you absolutely have no other choice. Believe me, they are painful. What that did to my body, though, is deteriorate me even more because my immune system was already compromised. And here I am adding more fuel to the fire. So it only ended up reverting to things getting made worse in my body. I remember so clearly my husband and I decided to take a trip to Cabo and just go celebrate that finally the worst of the worst we thought was over. And this was in August of 2018. We're celebrating that I'm finally better. My back is finally feeling somewhat better. I'm back at work. And just so everyone knows, at this point, I'm the vice president, the one and only female vice president of talent acquisition at my company, a huge electrical and construction firm, one of the top leading electrical contractors in the nation. And I was excited. I went back to work and I just wanted time to go celebrate, right, with my husband. So we're there and we're super excited that we're just relaxing. I'm putting my contacts on and I realize there's a little tremor in my hand. Small, little, almost unnoticeable to me who had been paying attention to every little detail of what's happening in your body.
Sure.
So I tell my husband and he says, don't worry about it. It's just probably nothing. we'll go to the doctor when we get back home. 4 days later, my hand is actually not shaking. Now it's not just a little tremor. Now it's my whole entire hand. I immediately started getting all sorts of therapy for my hands. Nothing worked. Instead of getting better, both of my hands, now it wasn't just one, both hands were shaking. And that just began a series of, we really don't know what's happening, because it was like pulling a little thread, one thing after another. My not only hands started shaking, I started feeling like I was being electrocuted day in and day out. And I mean, physically, I recruited people, electricians for a living, and I felt like I was being electrocuted every single day.
Electrocuted.
It was just beyond nuts. On top of that, I feel like I'm being stabbed all throughout my body. And this is consistent day and night. Meanwhile, I am convincing myself I am going forward no matter what. I'm not letting this stop me.
And you were working during all this.
I'm working, and I am telling my body I'm in charge, not you. So I kept on going, and ignored every signal that my body gave me. Fast forward to December of 2018, the same tingling, pins and needle sensation, the constant tremors, and now the feeling of being electrocuted in my upper extremities. I start to feel them in the lower extremities too, beginning with my feet, all the way up to my legs. And just thinking about it, sitting here, brings those horrific memories of the agony of fighting my mindset and convincing myself that what I had already experienced from my upper extremities, I was now going to start feeling the wrath of now the rest of my body. And I had to literally give myself consistent therapy of, you will be fine. You will be fine. And you know what? More than anything, it wasn't therapy. It's going back to biblically knowing that if something was coming, that God was already, he had already prepared everything that I needed to be just at rest, that things were going to be okay. And it was hard. Let me tell you, it was hard. I don't care that I'm a pastor's wife. I don't care that I'm a very dedicated person to God, in knowing that I will be okay. When you're tested, when you're actually confronted with the reality, you do get questioned even in your own mind. So convincing my mind that I was going to be okay was the toughest part. But it was at the beginning of the new year, because that was the fastest in most, I would say, without even, it almost felt like it was without skipping a beat, that led to a fast paralysis. I remember one day that, meanwhile, I'm experiencing a lot of stress at work. And during this, I'm telling myself and everyone at work that this is just something temporary. No one really knows the reality of what I'm actually dealing with every single day, because I didn't want to verbalize it either. I didn't want to tell it out there and basically have the whole world know that I'm going through this situation, because I'm convinced that I'm going to be okay. So as all of this is happening, I went to a meeting that really changed my life. I got destroyed in that meeting, my confidence, my everything. And I remember telling myself, I need to make a change, but I didn't even know how. I knew I needed to do it, not only for my own health, but also if I wanted to be alive, to be able to even be here for my kids. So I went home that day, and I just remember crawling into my bed and praying and saying, God, help me. What most people don't know is that that day I left the office with the intent of going home to just hug my family, and I thought I was going to die. The pain was so much in my body that I can't even articulate how getting up and pacing myself with very little ability to walk at this point. Actually, I was in just so much pain. I can't even begin to describe the severity of it. I attempted 2 hours later to get up from my bed, and when I went to get up, I held myself up, or so at least I attempted to. I fell flat on my face. Sorry.
You're fine. You're fine.
That was the last time that I could walk. I was fully paralyzed, head to toe. But my mind was completely sharp the whole entire time. I literally went from a normal healthy weight of 120 pounds all in 1 year to about 90 pounds. And during that time, I had to be okay with others doing things for me, doing my hair, brushing my teeth. And it's one of the hardest things that I learned, that as humans, we like our ego and we love our ego being really inflated. Here I am, super successful individual, and in my mind, this could never happen to someone like me. And it did. And I knew I needed a miracle. I knew I needed a miracle desperately. I went to over 16 doctors. None of them could figure out what was going on. As we fast forward to now, I'm fully paralyzed and we still don't know what to do. I'm at home completely paralyzed with almost very little ability to even eat, because nothing would actually stay in my stomach. Even water, liquid would just blurb out. No one, again, could land on what was actually really happening. All we knew is that I had a lot of activity going on in my liver, and they kept on asking, do you drink? And I'm like, yeah, water I do, but that's about it. I've never had an alcoholic beverage in my life that at all, or lost control for, any substance or anything. So I'm like, no. So they can find the result. Anyway, somehow God just simply allowed for me to pass out one day in my husband's arms, and that allowed my husband to call 911. I woke up in the hospital. I don't know what really happened. I really don't know whether if I had a heart attack in that moment or just simply passed out. The doctors said that they couldn't even figure it out themselves. But that was really the beginning of, we need to figure out what's really happening. And instead of getting better, I'm getting worse. My husband is reaching out to you throughout this whole entire process. And you're part of this whole story and this journey more than anyone else, really, because you were the person that my husband leaned on during this whole entire time. As I am getting worse, the doctors consistently kept on saying the same thing. It's stress. It's stress. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never met a person that went paralyzed because of stress. But here I am, without any answers. So fast forward to, just a couple of weeks within the hospital, they still can't figure anything out. I start inhaling my food. It starts going down in the wrong pipe. And I start coughing and start gagging every time that I eat. Good. And that led to now, Wilson, husband, we now have to intubate Mayra because something is happening within her lungs. They've shut down completely, and we don't even know if we can actually get her to come back at this point, but we will attempt. They sent me into ICU. I was aware, again, my mind was always sharp throughout this whole entire process. So they told me they needed to induce me into a coma. And I remember looking out the window, and of course I had high medication for the pain. So that actually did make me hallucinate a little bit. And I remember looking out the window and telling my husband, wow, we're in our second honeymoon. Those were the last words my husband heard before I start gagging again. They get him out of the hospital room that I'm in, and they rush to get me into ICU and into intubated much faster than they thought, because I started coughing so much.
I remember, let me just pause for a second. Looking back now, it's a little humorous, but then it wasn't. But your husband would call me and tell me some of the things that you were saying in those moments of where you weren't quite lucid.
Yeah. Tell me, what were some of them?
I'm trying to remember, but one of them, he said, if I remember right, it had something to do with either your mother or your grandmother. I'm trying to remember. It's been, 4 or 5 years ago now. So, but I remember him saying, she's just not talking correctly, Pastor. She's just seeing things.
Yes.
And
I'll tell you one of the ones that he probably called you about. And this is probably
I'm trying to remember, but go ahead.
I know which one it was. I was hallucinating that my mother and my two daughters were being harassed, molested, or even
That's what it was.
By these two people that were clearly just trying to harm them. And I was convinced that they were right behind us, and I could hear them actually
That's what it
doing
was.
this kind of stuff. So my husband, because he wouldn't listen, and at this point, because none of this is humorous, like you said, because something serious was happening in that room, they put a camera, the doctors put a camera in my room because they were so distraught with them trying to figure out what was going on, and they couldn't, that they decided to put a camera in my room to watch everything that's happening, what I'm being fed, I'm supposing.
Wow.
And maybe because they were afraid that a potential lawsuit was coming, who knows? What I do know is that there's this camera that's watching me, and I'm watching this little red button that's, flashing, and I'm thinking, it's the bad guys. It's the ones that have my mom and my two kids. So I tell my husband,
I know it wasn't funny then, but it wasn't funny then, but it is now.
As he leaned in, I literally, legit bit his ear, and I said, listen to me.
You took a page from Mike Tyson's playbook.
He said, listen to me.
I'm glad I didn't come near you. You could have bit my other arm off.
That would have been catastrophic. You kind of need the only one you have.
I would have been able to wear a lefty shirt.
So Wilson proceeds to actually, after getting his ear bit, he proceeds to grab the trash can, grabs it behind me so that I couldn't see him, and he starts beating it against the wall. And then he goes, okay, I've got the bad guys. So with tears in my eyes, I said,
you're bringing it back to my mind now. I remember that. I got the bad guys. He told me, he goes, I just beat the trash can against the wall. And I remember when he told me that, we were both, I think we were on the phone. It may have been when one of the times I went to see you in the hospital, but I remember laughing. I said, I know that's not funny, but that's funny. It's just funny.
You've really helped my parents as well, because my parents were all here. Everyone ended up coming out. You really helped them to not just be in the moment of experiencing what was in their mind potentially coming, but you constantly gave them words of wisdom to stay not only focused on expecting that miracle, but you also gave them humor, and thank you for that.
Well,
it really meant a lot to them.
I think sometimes I get onto myself because I use humor a little too much, but I think we have to understand that, this life, it is difficult at times, but God promised an abundant life. And I think we have to experience that in every struggle, in every trial. We have to have this abundance. I hope you enjoyed this first part one of this story. What an incredible story. If you're watching this, I hope that you enjoyed this. If you're listening to this, I hope that you enjoyed it. We're going to be launching in just a few days, part 2. You don't want to miss it. Look for us at YouTube. Check us out on Podcast Land. Have an incredible day. And remember, you too can overcome. Just put your mind to it and trust in what God has put in you to do great things. He's able to work through us. It's an amazing adventure, this thing called life. God bless.